Welcome to the History with Ali podcast, where we discuss all things history, literature, and media studies. Today, I'm joined by author and historian Adrienne Dillard. Okay, so Adrienne, welcome to the podcast. As I've been saying, it's so nice to finally meet you because we've been in the same online circles since at least COVID, I
Oh,
think.
yeah. It's been quite a while. Yes, it's so nice to actually be able to chat with you face to face and get to see your beautiful face and talk to you.
Yeah, right back at you. Actually, we could be sisters, I feel like.
We
We
probably
kind of have a
could.
vibe going. I'm seeing some similarities.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. We're like sisters from another mister. We'll just say that.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So I've been reading The Raven's Widow and absolutely loving it. So
Oh,
I
thank
thought
you.
if it would be okay with you, we could talk a little bit about Jane and talk about how you
Yeah.
came to the book. So what inspired you to write about Jane?
Well, I kind of have been interested in the Boleyn families since going back quite a long time. In fact, as most people, my introduction was The Other Boleyn Girl, the movie. But then I chose to write about Catherine Carey, which is actually, it's so cool because now there is another book. Alison Weir has a novel coming out about Catherine Carey, and I'm so excited to read it. So that's just a little sidebar, but that is how I started out with Catherine Carey. And so I kind of had some relevance to Jane as a side sort of character in my novel that she interacted with a little bit. And I guess I knew that she wasn't what people made her out to be, but I hadn't really taken the time to dive into that. And then in 2015, I ended up having to have a hysterectomy. And so I was laid up for like 6 weeks. I couldn't do anything. And it just so happened to be around this time of year, which, as we know, is the anniversary of Catherine Howard and Jane's execution. And so I was seeing a lot of content online because, of course, I was like rotting on the couch on painkillers. And I was going through this feeling of I only had one child, and I had never really imagined having a big family, but I imagined having more children. And I suddenly realized that was not going to be my story. And I was having some feelings about that. And they were kind of unexpected because I never was much of like, I wasn't one of those people who wanted babies like right away. I liked kids, but I wasn't ready. And so I didn't have my son until I was like 27 years old. And so then to all of a sudden, within 5 years, have a hysterectomy, it hit me really hard. And I was thinking as I was going through this, and I'm reading about Catherine and I'm reading about Jane, and there's so much out there saying that she had a terrible relationship with her husband because they didn't have any children, and that kind of myth grew up. And I was thinking about that, and it occurred to me that it was like there are so many reasons why women cannot have children, or that maybe they can't complete a full pregnancy, or sometimes, and it's even the males. And I started to think about the calendar because back then you could only have intercourse with your spouse at certain times of the year. You couldn't do it on holidays, at like certain holy holidays, and you couldn't on Sundays, and you couldn't on this and this. And then thinking about George, who's traveling a lot and he's spending so much time with the king. When you think about it, there are really only so many opportunities in a woman's life to get pregnant in the first place. But then when you think about all of these other sort of complications that could happen, it really made me look at Jane in a different way. It made me consider more that there was probably a lot here that hadn't really been explored. It was just really easy to write off a lot of her story. So, of course, just around that time, there was a book that had come out by Julia Fox. I recommend it to everybody. It was practically my Bible for years. The thing is beat up. I used to carry it around in my car with me because I would do so much writing just wherever I was at. But so that's how I came to start writing about Jane. I just felt this sort of kinship with her. And I wanted to, it kind of started at exploring perhaps why there were fertility issues, but really it led me much deeper into the Boleyn family and other connections. And I grew a deep attachment to George out of it. And I'm still, even now, years later, researching on him.
That's so interesting. And women's fertility is all over the Tudors. It's
Yeah.
so sad. It comes up sometimes. I'm like, I might need a break from executions and miscarriages. It's really
Right.
sad. But in all seriousness, that comes up with so many of the queens.
Yes.
And yeah, poor Jane, there's that conversation in the book with Thomas Boleyn, right? When
Yes.
he's like, "You brought nothing to us." And that was
Yeah.
so heartbreaking. But what I really thought was so interesting in the novel is you did portray Jane as loving George and as being very loyal to Anne, which I thought was very nuanced because there really isn't that much in the historical record that can prove that she
Right.
worked against them. So was that kind of came from your research, and then how did you
Yeah.
like mix it into your fiction?
I was very lucky because very early on, I stumbled across the inventory that belonged to Jane when she was executed. And of course, we have the letter where she wrote a letter to Cromwell, basically asking for all of the things that were confiscated from her husband when he was executed. And one of the biggest things was this bed, right? Which, of course, that was like your most expensive piece of furniture at that time. And so she asks for this bed back. She asks for the hangings and the quilt. And it's very specific. You don't see it in the letter, but when you look at the inventory, you can see very specifically like it has Rochford knots on it and lover's knots on it, and it's yellow. So it just gave me just this picture. She is trying to hold on to this last piece of her marriage, this last piece. And it's representative of so much. It's not just representative of her husband and her relationship, it's also representative of her place in court and her place as the sister in law who was the queen, right? Even though, yes, she was executed, like she still was the queen. This is just these items are so symbolic of her life, and she fights for them and she does actually get them back. And then later on, as I got into it a little bit more, I had another historian who was researching Lord Morley, and she reached out to me and she said, I found this listing of the godparents for Jane's brother, Henry Parker the younger. It's listings of his children's godparents, and you see that George and Jane are both listed as godparents to their children. And the fact that he was obviously very close with Jane's brother, right? So you see that family connection there, because otherwise, why would he be naming him as the godfather, right? And George is being named along with Princess Mary as well. And so you're seeing what we think is these factions, but really they do have differences of opinions on many things, but they're so intermingled and they're so before Anne's fall that it was just so fascinating to me to see that not only was Jane a big part of the Boleyns, but George was also a part of the Parkers. They accepted him as family. And I just thought that that was really interesting, and it spoke a lot of volumes. Plus, she was the only one who did reach out to him while he was in prison. Everybody else kind of just was like, we're not even going to attempt that, but she does. And I think that we can't underestimate the risk that she takes in doing that. And not only doing that, but then for the rest of her life, she wears black. It's recorded that, and then if you look at her inventories and stuff, she wears a lot of black. And Princess Mary was even giving her black to wear. She was giving her fabric. We have it in Princess Mary's inventory. Her and Jane would kind of exchange gifts with each other. And it's so fascinating to me to think that Princess Mary is supporting Jane's mourning, like public mourning of the man that her father executed. Speaking of nuance, I think there's a tendency that we look at these people and we think, well, they're on this side and they're on that side, and there's no intermingling, and they're enemies, and they're, but the reality is that they were best friends and enemies with the turn of a day. It all just depended upon what mood the king was in that day and who was on his hit list, and who, because you had to be very pragmatic and flexible. And so I just don't think that we can take these little pieces of information and say, well, Jane, they had a terrible marriage, because there are just as many other pieces of information that actually are opposite to that. So I think if we look at the picture as a whole, I think we're just seeing a very nuanced relationship. And sure, there probably were moments, as we all, if we've been married, we know it's not always perfect all of the time. And I can imagine in a situation at court, it was so high pressure, and you didn't, like I said, like with a turn of a day, you didn't know where you were going to be standing, or who was your best friend and who was your enemy. And so I just think all of these other little nuanced things just give us something a little deeper to think about.
Because strategically about the wearing black, it would be easier to just put that aside and go on and not make it a topic of
Right.
conversation to stay, especially when she goes with Jane Seymour. So it's really interesting. And in the book, there's that scene where her brother tells her that George has been arrested.
Yeah.
And I thought like it came from the right person, but I thought, I don't know if this was, if I was reading it correctly, but I kind of saw her nerves and mental health sway a little bit there.
Yeah.
And I know, not to cut to the chase, but of course, when she
Yeah.
later is in the tower and they're
Yeah.
questioning her sanity, what I thought was interesting in this is that you could see through her life that these challenging circumstances affected her mental health. What did
Mhm.
you want to kind of like say about Jane's health? Do you think that it was just a strategy for her to try to stay alive
Yeah.
longer, or do you think she really dealt with some serious mental health stuff, or both?
Oh, I think she dealt with some serious mental health stuff. And I think that the circumstances of her life and the things that happened to her played a huge role in it. But also, I think that she had a genetic predisposition, because there was what they would have termed as madness in her family, in her grandfather. And the same woman who shared with me about the godparent thing, she was who I discovered it through, because she'd been studying the Parkers, Lord Morley and his father. And so there was mental illness on her family side. And so I think that probably a combination of the fact that, as we know, that there are genetic predispositions to certain, and I say that as somebody who, my mother has borderline personality disorder, my sister, she has bipolar disorder, and I have my own dissociative disorders. And it comes down from, a lot of that is also because that lends to the same kind of life, right? Because it perpetuates, the cycles perpetuate. And so I know that we tend to think of mental health as being like a very modern thing. And in many ways, the study of it, yes, is modern, but that does not mean that people did not suffer from these things before they had language for it or before they had study for it. And I think that the fact that the king was so determined to execute her, he had the law changed, which to me says that he was hedging his bets because he wasn't sure she was faking it. So he literally had the law changed. So even if she was faking it, it didn't matter. He changed the law so he could go ahead and execute her. And that to me says all sorts of things about Henry. But I think that also says that he took her from the Tower and sent her to John Russell's house to help. He sent his personal physician to go try to get her healed. And really, I mean, they probably just tried to prop her up as much as they could. But she had to have been really hurting and probably very panic stricken. And so I just think that there's so many other pieces that people did suspect she probably really was having a mental breakdown. So I don't think that she was faking it at all. And I think that if she was, there would be more sort of gossip about it, right? But we really only hear Chapuis, and he's pretty vague about it, to be honest. And so we have to wonder how much of it he actually knew as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because if she was trying to be strategic, I don't think that she would have gotten herself in the Tower in the first place.
Oh, exactly.
And so I always think it's interesting. Why did Henry allow her to come back to court after Anne's execution? Because she did come back in a very high position to serve Jane. So why would Henry want to see a Boleyn after
Well,
that?
I think that there could be many reasons. First of all, trying to guess at what Henry's reasons for doing anything, because he
So
was
true.
just so changeable. And a lot of times it was illogical why he chose to do the things that he did, but he did. But I think that it did a couple of things. First of all, it lent a legitimacy to what he did to their family, right? To see Jane back at court and serving his next wife, like that, even if it's all for show, we have to think about the perception that that gave, right? And that perception was positive to Henry, right? Well, they must have been terrible because now Jane is here. And that doesn't even say whether Jane wanted to be there or not. But I think she probably didn't have a lot of choice. And also Lord Morley, he had very close connections to the king, very close connections to Cromwell. He and Cromwell were like best buddies. They were sending each other stuff all the time. He was translating books for Cromwell. And so I think we have to know that Jane was in a much higher station than she was before she got married, when she lived at home before. And so the Morleys, they were not wealthy people. And Morley may have been a lord, but Lady Rochford, she's a viscountess, and she had to live in a particular style. And so it wasn't really like she could just go home and then her dad was gonna like, oh, pay to keep up her, like that just wasn't going to happen. And at the time, she didn't have control of her properties that she got in her marriage, because the way that Thomas Boleyn had done it, he gave them property, but the owner of the property was actually his mother. And she had not died yet. But the idea had been that George would outlive her. And so George would get her properties and that would become part. But the problem is George died before she did. And so Jane really had to wait until she could get those properties, and they still weren't even guaranteed to her. She actually had to have a bill passed in legislature in order to get those. And so I think it was just like that was what you had to do. Like she had to live as a viscountess. She had to keep up a particular style. And not only that, but she needed to take care of herself. And that was probably, going back to court, would have been the safest and the thing that she was most capable of doing. Because the second part of that is that Jane had been serving at court for pretty much all of her life. And so she knew the ins and outs and how you were supposed to behave and what you were supposed to do. After Anne left, they really cleaned house and brought in some different ladies that didn't have as much experience. So then you have Jane, who's kind of the elder mother type, and she's setting an example for them. And so, I mean, I think probably the best she could have hoped for was this second act of where she was going to go back and maybe she was going to be something like a mother of the maids, where that was kind of her role. And I think that that's kind of what happened.
What do you think her relationship with Cromwell was like?
That I really don't know, because she wrote him a letter. But the thing is I don't think that we can take too much from the letter, because widows were writing to Cromwell all the time. They were always writing to him and asking him for help. And many people were writing to him asking for help, because he was basically the next powerful person after the king. Ironically, I think if George had lived, Cromwell would have lived. And if Cromwell would have lived, Jane would have lived. It's like the death of George really brought down Cromwell and Jane at the same time, right? Because George was really the only person who could have saved Cromwell when Cromwell went down. Cromwell was the only person who could have saved Jane, and he wasn't around, right? And so I think the dominoes sort of just fell. And so I think that she could have had many different types of relationships with Cromwell. He could have been somebody who she really did trust. And that's why she wrote him, or she did it because her dad told her to, because they were friends, or she thought, well, this is what I need to do. This is the next thing. It could be any one of those. And there's nothing in the sources. There's no source that says that there was like, she was a spy for him. There's nothing. I mean, we have a lot of hearsay kind of afterwards, much, much later. But there's nothing from contemporary records that say that their relationship was anything other than he's the secretary to the king, and I have to deal with him if I want to move forward in life. It really could be either or, because we don't know. She could have been a spy for him. We really don't. I think it's unlikely, but I think that could be open to interpretation.
Yeah, and she ended up outliving him. So then what was it like when Anne of Cleves came around and she was still serving? Because people don't talk about her as much.
Yeah.
But I find her to be super interesting. I think she was extremely intelligent.
Oh,
She's
yeah.
so underrated. She may be the wisest of all of them for her actions of like leaving Henry. And
Mhm.
but what do you think it was like with Jane and Anne of Cleves?
I think it's really interesting, because I think Jane was really like kind of trying to keep her nose clean at this time. And so there's an interesting exchange, because the records indicate that they had a conversation as to whether or not the marriage with the king had been consummated. And of course, Jane is the person. It's always Jane. She is the person in the history saying, well, this is the conversation. And of course, it wasn't just her, because there were a couple of other ladies that were asked as well. And I think that I think that they probably got along well. And I think that had Anne stayed queen, it would have been really good for Jane, because of course she wouldn't have gotten sort of swept up in everything with Catherine Howard. And I think that Jane could have been a good example to Anne, in that teaching her how to mimic the English ways. so that she didn't stand out so much at the court. I think that had Anne been able to stay in her position for much longer, that things would have turned out much, much different for Jane. And I think that they would have gotten along really well. And certainly, I love the fact that she came back and spent Christmas with Catherine Howard and Henry. And of course, Jane would have been there. And it sounds like they actually had quite a lovely time. And I think that that is so, to me, that says so much about Anne's character and her pragmatism. And I would love to be as pragmatic as her.
Absolutely. And then, of course, Catherine Howard came along, and
Yeah.
Jane is significantly older than Catherine at this point, right? Like Catherine might be 14 to 16 originally, and Jane must be in her mid 30s by this
Oh,
point.
yeah. She would have been in her mid 30s by this time. And I think it's kind of interesting. Catherine's age, we don't really know exactly. I think Gareth Russell I mean, I would go with his age, which I think she was in her late teens, but she may have been younger. But I think, yeah, she definitely was a lot younger immaturity wise than Jane was. Even if she wasn't that much younger chronologically, she definitely had the immaturity where Jane had much more time, mature in that sense.
I think that Culpeper and Catherine blamed Jane for their downfall, which makes me think that it isn't Jane's fault that all of this occurred. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think it's Jane's fault at all. Although I will say that I can see this impulsivity in Jane, and I can see it in the way, because you can read the transcripts of her, well, they're not exactly transcripts, but they're pretty detailed, of when they questioned her about Catherine. And some of her responses are pretty, I mean, she says, like, well, I don't really know, but if you ask me, I'm pretty sure they did. Like, she just kind of blurts that out. And as somebody who does have certain mental health things, I have a tendency to be impulsive and just blurt things out too. And it gets me into a lot of trouble. And so sometimes I think that there were so many things at play, that, like, we're looking at the power dynamic between Catherine and Jane, right? You do what your queen tells you to do. But also at the same time, Jane is a little bit of a loose cannon, right? And I don't think that's through fault of her own necessarily. I think that she's been put through the freaking ringer, and she's been gaslit, and she's been all of these, she watched her family die. You have to imagine, like, how the effect that has on you. And it's true that trauma does change. It changes your brain chemistry, and it can change your personality, and it can make you do things that are riskier, more impulsive, that you don't think through things before you do them. And I say that as somebody who's fully experienced all of those things. I have complex PTSD. And so I guess I related to that on a level, like, I could see how that could happen. And plus, we're looking at this pressure cooker. The king is sick. We don't know if he's going to die. He's avoiding Catherine. So Catherine is, of course, at her highest panic, right? It's like she's enjoying it because she's not having to deal with him. But then at the same time, when Henry's alone, that's when you are at your most dangerous, because you don't know what he's cooking up, and you don't know who he is cooking it up with. You don't know who is your enemy, and especially as the queen. And it's demonstrated that Henry, he will murder his queens. If you put just all of those things, it's like you're putting them all in a pressure cooker, and just one false move, just one, sure, I'll help you meet with Culpeper, like, that's the end, because there's so many things going on. And I like to think that maybe there was a little revenge in it, right? Because,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and really, Jane, I feel like Jane may have had position to lose, but at that point, personally, she did not have a lot to lose. And especially if she was in any kind of way having mental struggles, she may have thought to herself that, you know what? Anne wasn't cheating on you, but I'm going to go ahead and help Catherine because you know what? You deserve it. And really, he did deserve it. But Catherine didn't deserve what happened to her. And Jane didn't deserve what happened to her. And I can't say for sure that had any type of play into it. But like I said, these people are very nuanced and we can't really guess at what they were thinking or what their motivations were unless they wrote it down. And so many people, they didn't write it down and they talked to each other through the language of court. And so you have to be able to decipher. And this project actually that I'm working on right now is one of George Boleyn's books that I've already gone through once, but I'm going to go back through again. But this book, so many things have been said about it, but as I'm translating it, I'm realizing like it's all allegory. People, we don't talk in allegory anymore, but that's almost exact only thing that they talked in was allegory. And so we have to be able to read through the lines of what they are saying when they do say what their motivations are, or when they're writing letters to people or writing in their diary or whatever. We have to remember that everything was almost sort of coded.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of what we know about particularly Jane comes from allegory, right? Because it comes from metrical visions, or it comes from these like histories that people were writing. And so much of it was in allegory. And so it's all symbolism. And I think we just have to apply the human emotion spectrum to these people, because it could be either or. And my hope is that, yeah, there was a little bit of that in there of like, you took everything from me for a lie. And now it actually is happening. And maybe at that point, she just thought to herself, well, I'm in it for a penny. So I might as well help. She was going to help Catherine. And maybe she thought that she knew better. She thought that I've been through this. I can now help her navigate that. I mean, it could be any of these, but I tend to think it's a little bit of everything.
That reminds me of your work on George. One of my favorite scenes was when he came back to their chambers with his friend, and she was like, "Is he singing about me right now?" I thought that was so funny. And she's like, "He is singing about me right now. I want to sleep."
I had such a good time writing about George and Thomas Wyatt together. I can just imagine they're like drunken, like spouting poetry at each other. And I just imagined Jane coming home and being like, what the hell? I'm trying to go to bed after waiting on these women all day long. And you guys are like drunk.
That
poetry.
That I know that could happen. That same thing could happen today. What's the Taylor Swift album called? What's her poet?
Tortured Poets Department. Yes, that was it.
Yeah.
Thomas Wyatt and George Boleyn were the Tortured Poets Department, the original Tortured Poets Department. Have you ever checked out the Devonshire manuscript?
No.
Oh my gosh, you have to look it up. You can actually see scans of it, but it's this manuscript. And actually, I kind of reference it in a very like covert way in Raven's Widow of this poetry book. And they're writing, like the Shelton ladies are like writing in it, and Thomas Wyatt wrote in it. And there are questions that maybe George wrote in it because there are a lot of anonymous poems. And so basically, it was just this book of poetry, and they passed it along while they were all serving at Anne Boleyn's court, and it still exists. So you can find it and you can read these poems. And there were like two people who were writing love poems to each other in it. It's
Aw.
really, really cute. But yeah, they would do that. So they would just write their little ditty in there, and then they would pass it along to the next person. And it's such a fascinating vision of what these young people were thinking about and talking about amongst each other at court during this time. And it's really cute, and it's so interesting.
Because ultimately, she was one of the greatest witnesses of the Tudor time period. So she must have also experienced the highs serving the queens.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean,
Like
I like
Jane
it.
getting pregnant with or having the son, I'm sure that
Yeah.
finally, although that could have been triggering for her because of everything that happened
Yeah.
before, or it was like an amazing moment, probably for the whole court, because
I
all of a
bet they
sudden
were
it's
all
like, Queen, chill.
relieved.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think that those moments probably were pretty epic for her to witness. So, do you think that she was happy?
I think she probably found moments of happiness. I think that she was actually in a really good position for much of her time after George because she didn't get married. So she was able to sort of live how she wanted to within reason. And she never got remarried, which I find really, really interesting. So, and I kind of have a little insight into that now, and it's still very kind of new. I haven't delved too far into it, but in this other project that I'm working on, I came across the translation so there was a translation that Lord Morley did for Henry VIII that it's called, and I'm probably going to butcher it, Declaris Maloribus, I think, but it's based on this work where it's a bunch of biographies of historical women, but a lot of them are like mythological women and stuff like that as well. But he had a biography in there for Dido, and she's a Greek mythological figure. So I was reading the Henry Morley translation. And if you've read Julia Fox's book, she talks about how in this same translation, his bio for Iphigenia, she thinks that there's a reference to Jane in there because they're saying that she gets her head cut off for another woman's offense or something along those lines. So it's the same book. It's just a different entry in the book, and it's for Dido. And it talks about how they did not believe that you should get remarried because that was considered bigamy. And this is all stuff that I'm also finding in this book of George Boleyn's that I'm translating. And so I'm finding all of these connections, but I thought it was so fascinating because I've found three things where it talks about how they believe that getting married after your first marriage was considered bigamy, and that women were supposed to wear black to show that they were in mourning for the rest of their lives after their spouses died. And that was how it was supposed to be. And the fact that Morley, he really reiterated this in his Boccaccio book, it just made me think. Now I need to go back and do much more research before I could say, oh, he was definitely talking about Jane. But it gave me a different perspective to view that from, because Morley was adding his own little thoughts when he was translating. And he is so complimentary of Dido that she does not get married and she wears black. And so I was like, okay, so like even if he's not talking about Jane, we're seeing that this was Lord Morley's perspective. And I think that's probably why Jane did not remarry. I think also she probably had affection for George, and that was part of it as well. But I also think that her dad imbued it in her that you get married once and that is your marriage and then you are a widow. And so I found that really interesting, and it made me think that Jane was really actually in a very good position after he died, because she did have a lot of control over what she did have and the way in which that she could live her life for the most part. So it's really interesting to think about her in that way.
And what do you think her legacy is these days? Do you think that people are taking a second look? Do you think that like the Victorian historians kind of twisted her narrative to fit their expectations of women?
I mean, I think her legacy is that she's definitely getting a second look. It's fascinating because when I started researching, if I ever, and I was constantly getting tagged in these like debates and all these like Tudor Facebook groups. Oh my gosh, I would be like, not again. And I would go in there and I would give my pitch and I would be like, this isn't true because of this. I even had a copy and paste, right? Because I was getting tagged so often. And I just realized that people were committed to believing what they wanted to believe of her, no matter what you put in front of them. They were just really committed to that. So I finally realized, I was like, I'm just going to focus on my research. I'm going to write about Jane, how I see her through the historical record. And I'm going to stop getting so emotionally charged every time somebody repeats all, because I could just make myself crazy doing that. So to get back to that, seeing the way she was spoken about in those circles back then as compared to now, that like I'm not on Facebook anymore, but I do go into like the Tudor subreddit and I follow it on Instagram and stuff like that. And I see that the discourse about Jane has changed so dramatically, and like that to me has been so heartwarming, because man, I came up against so much negativity. And I still remember one of my reviews of The Raven's Widow was like, this is historically inaccurate. I was like, well, it is novel, it is fiction, but, and yeah, like I used to like take it so personally because I was just like, I was so team Jane. And I was like, don't you understand? She's so misunderstood. And I still do think that. And I think that we need to challenge inaccurate history. Like, oh, it's one thing in a novel, and as a novelist I can say that, I mean, there are things in my novels that I had to make, like, you have to make them up, you have to. But when we're writing nonfiction and we're talking about our novels in a nonfiction way, when we are talking about the history behind them, we have a duty that we need to treat these women fairly, and we need to treat them as if they were still alive, right? We can't just slander people for absolutely no reason. We live in a time right now where women are being systematically silenced, right? We're being told to shut up. We're being told we're too dumb to vote. We're being told that it's okay to use us and our bodies in ways that however you want to. And anybody who's reading the news today, women are basically like enemy number one, or we're treated like that, spoken about in that way. And it affects everything, because that's how we talk about these historical figures. That's how we talk about Jane Boleyn, and we don't blink an eye over it. Oh yeah, she deserved her execution. I wish her execution had been worse. People would say that about her. And then they would talk about Anne like she's this home wrecker and she's this. Well, no, she didn't. Henry wrecked his own home. Like, what choice really did she have? She was probably trying to make the best out of this situation that, like, how do you get out of it? She just tried to do what was the best, as any of us would. We talk about these historic figures as if they're not people, if they were not humans, they're just names on a page, but they're really not. I take it very seriously that I have made a significant amount of money writing about these dead women. To me, I have a duty that I need to uphold their legacy in some way because I am making money off of their lives. There's an integrity that comes along with that. And sometimes it does get me into trouble because if I if I see something, if I see poor history, and I'm not saying that I'm perfect, not at all means, but if I do see where somebody is not getting properly cited, or I see that we're totally dismissing historical evidence or accusing others of making up narratives, well, we're all biased. That's why we got into history, because we took a side. Like,
Totally.
you can't erase bias from history. That's why we're historians, is because we took a side. We try to remain neutral, but the whole reason why we're historians is because we took a side and we decided that we wanted to explore why we took that side. Why do we feel that way? And so I think her legacy is that it's reminding us that we still talk about women this way today. We love to talk about the Real Housewives and how bitchy they are and how conniving and all of those things, right? We love a drama. We love a drama queen. We love all of that. But the reality is, a lot of times that is used to that kind of language is used to demean us and demean our contributions. And so I think her legacy, which I try to practice, is to call that out and to make people aware that language matters and the way that we speak about people. I mean, they're not here. Jane cannot hear you speak about her, but women in your life hear you speak about her. And the people who watched the Tudors, they watched how she was portrayed. And we just need to be more careful about how we treat humans and how we speak about them. And remember that they are, in fact, humans, just like we are.
I've definitely found that the authors that I've spoken to, who are mainly independent authors, seem to have the most integrity and love for the characters and the people. So I think that's really sweet. And Jane is lucky that you have taken up her flag. I could literally talk to you for hours, and I hope you'll come back, please, so we can talk about the Titanic and your other books. But what are you working on, and where can the listeners find you?
Well, you can find me on my website. It's adrienne-dillard.com, because adriennedillard.com was taken. Surprisingly, there are a lot of Adrienne Dillards out there. But yeah, so that's my website. And of course, you can find me on Instagram. And I'm kind of like shifting, because I've been working on a book that was sort of like a memoir, but also kind of tied in with The City of Ladies, the book of The City of Ladies by Christine de Pizan, which is connected with this book of George's, The Lamentations of Matthiolus. I have found so many mind-blowing connections about this book. It's just crazy. So back when I went to England in 2018, I was studying Jane, because I was writing the book about Jane. I went to the British Library to go see her jewel inventory because I
My
needed to
gosh.
know all of her jewels, right? And so I actually had to go, and I got to see so many incredible things. I got to see letter from John D with his beautiful signature. Oh my gosh.
Oh my
And
God.
I got to see Jane Boleyn's letter. I got to see a lot. But while I was there, I made sure to see the book that they say it was confiscated from George when he was executed. And it's a manuscript and it has two poems in it. It has the Lamentations of Matthiolus, or the Torments of Marriage. And then the second half of the book is Le Livre de Lis, which is the Book of Gladness. So the first is a translation of the Lamentations of Matthiolus, and then the second is the translator's response, because it's a very misogynistic poem.
Oh.
And so the other one is like the opposite. It refutes that. And so I'm very curious about this book that George has had. So I got to see it in 2018. And you can see, like it says, this book is mine, George Boleyn. And then below that, it says, Et moi, M. Smeaton. So Mark Smeaton had the book. And Thomas Wyatt, he wrote in the back of it, and they would write each other messages on the paste flaps of the back of the book. So there's all kinds of inscriptions and stuff, and I want to go back. That's what I'm going back to London for, is to go back and see this book again. But I found connections because the translator, he was inspired to do this by Christine de Pizan in the Book of the City of Ladies. We'll come to find out Anne Boleyn had a collection of City of Ladies tapestries.
Wow.
That have since gone missing.
No.
So they were delivered to Elizabeth after Anne was executed, and we don't know where they've gone since then. But it's just really fascinating because here Anne had these tapestries that were the Book of the City of Ladies, and then George had a book that was inspired by the Book of the City of Ladies that somehow was with Wyatt and Smeaton, and then ended up in the King's Library. And it's actually in the King's Library. It's not in any, the reason why we know that it's George's book is because George wrote in it. Like, it wasn't in any of his inventories. It was in the King's inventory from Whitehall, one of his last ones that was taken. So it was in the King's Library. So I actually don't know if it was taken at his execution or if George passed it to the king.
Ooh.
So this is what I'm kind of working on.
Wow.
Right,
that is so cool.
Yeah. So that's the next sort of project.
Wow, that's so exciting. I feel like you're going to end up collaborating with Hever Castle or something too, because I bet they want that George book too over there.
Oh, yeah, it's really fascinating. And I found it in the British Library, but I don't know how aware people are that it's there, because it's not necessarily, I think I had to look it up under Henry and not actually under George Boleyn. And so, yeah, I don't know if they've been able to see it or not, but I'm sure that they would really be interested in the book and stuff.
Yeah, I can see this definitely as an exhibit in the future on George. So that's so great. Well, thank you so much for coming on my little podcast. It's been amazing to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I had such a good chat with you.
Same. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome, Allie.